So I wanted to take a break from just rebuilding the Legend clutch, master cylinder, and slave cylinder to do a little bit of research to try to maybe help the community. Try to see how we can keep these Legends on the road if rebuilding these things becomes, I don't know, impossible or just really difficult to do. So um, it's kind of a common thing here in the Legend community. Here recently, within the past couple years, people have been saying you can use a 1997 or up. There's a date range there, but a Honda Prelude slave cylinder on a Legend, and supposedly it works fine. It bolts up fine, and everything's good. But me being an engineer by schooling, and having that engineering brain, I really wanted to dive into the different options and figure out, is the Prelude the best option? If again you can't rebuild your OEM parts. So what I did is I went to AutoZone, and luckily the nice gentleman working there was willing to help me with this. But I went through and I got a variety of different clutch, master cylinders and slave cylinders, sort of from different years, different sort of eras, and different cars, all obviously within the Honda Acura brand. So what we have here laid out across my workbench is obviously the Legend 91 through 95 Legend master cylinder, slave cylinder. I've got rebuild kits for these that I got on eBay. And then I've got a master cylinders and slave cylinders for 95 Integras or 95 Civics. They're the same. 97 Prelude, 95 Accord V6 or inline 4, 2009 Accord, and 2002 S2000. So again, not again, but I have specific model years written down on these cards. Those are just the model years I searched when finding these part numbers. Now, of course, these parts that are meant for a 95 Integra, they're likely going to be good for a 94, a 96 Integra. So when you go to search for these parts in the future, if you go to search for them in the future, no, it's not that specific model year. It's that generation of that car. So let's dive into the slave cylinders first, and then we'll come back and talk about all the master cylinders. So again, we have the Legend one here, and I'm going to start out comparing with the Prelude because this is the one that's commonly used by Legend owners as a replacement. So the things to look for when comparing these are going to be mainly your bore diameter, and in turn the diameter of the piston that goes in the bore, and also sort of the stroke length or the depth of that piston hole, and how far the little piston can travel inside of it. The other things to look at are going to be this push rod that sticks out the end of the slave cylinder, and are the other ones going to be similar. And then also mounting, are the bolt holes the right spacing? Are the bolt flanges here, are they the right angle? So these are all things to take into consideration when trying to find a potential suitable replacement. So again, most people in the Legend community recently have been using these Prelude slave cylinders. Now hopefully you can see this in the video, but when I hold the body of the cylinder, the two cylinders parallel with each other, okay, you can kind of see the mounting tabs on the Legend kind of angle over to the left, and the mounting tabs for the Prelude angle over to the right. So that's one notable difference, something that we need to be aware of, and what are the ramifications of that, if any. The other things to compare, like I said, bore. So it's the same size bore, same size piston. That's all good. The spacing, I've got these mounting holes covered up because I'm just about to paint this, but the spacing of the holes is the same. When you compare the Prelude with the Integra or Civic one, essentially everything is the same. The angle on the mounting tabs relative to the body is the same. The bore is the same. The piston is the same. The connection for the clutch line is the same. The only difference is going to be where the bleeder valve is. And on the Integra or Civic, the bleeder valve kind of comes out at an angle on the back here. I've held this underneath my car just to test this out, and I noted that when you hold this up in there, the bleeder valve here, it comes really close to the transmission tunnel, where the body is of the transmission tunnel. So you might be able to use one of these, but it's going to come really close to touching. You may have trouble bleeding it. One alternative possibly would be to shorten up this nipple here, or shorten up the threads and just get a little bit more clearance. This would bolt up. If you did that, these will both bolt up in the same way. But I'm going to show you here in a minute. I don't like how either of these bolt up. I don't like how the angle of the mounting tabs cause this to be mounted when sitting flush against the transmission. It causes this to be too much of an angle, and I'm going to show you why that's a problem later. But again, wanted to compare them since a lot of you guys are running these, or there's a lot of information on the Facebook group and on the forums about using these. Now, before we move on, because these are the same bore diameter and have the same piston diameter, you can definitely go buy a Prelude or an Integra slave cylinder, and you can take these internal components out. You compare them with what came out of the Legend, and that's going to be a suitable replacement. Hopefully you can see that. Same size, same shape, same length. So if you're rebuilding your Legend one and you clean out the inside of this bore here, like I'm going to do later in the video, you should then just be able to stick this right in here, and you've made your Legend slave cylinder, essentially brand new again. Should operate like new. But some of y'all maybe don't have the ability. You don't have a workshop. You don't have the tools to be able to do this, and maybe y'all are looking for a more of a bolt-in replacement. So move on down the line here. The 09 Accord, it's, as you can see, it's very different. So it is not going to be a suitable replacement. But the bore diameter is the same, the piston is the same. So I do think you could still rob these parts and put them in here if you needed to. Then comes the 2002 S2000. This is very intriguing to me. I'm beginning to think this might be the right application, the right part number to use as a replacement for the Legend. If you hold the bodies parallel to each other, you can see, hopefully you can see on the video, how the bolt holes here, the tabs, they sit at the same exact angle relative to the shock body. That's good. That to me is way better than the Prelude or the Integra option. But we do have a couple differences here. One of the differences is going to be that the piston, the bore diameter and the piston is just slightly larger. Now I measured all these with my calipers earlier, um, but this measures just slightly larger. So what's that going to mean? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Other than that, the length of the body is essentially the same. And even though, another thing to note, even though the mounting tabs are at the same angle relative to the body, you may be able to see how the distance between the front of this body and the first bolt hole is maybe, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch or something like that. And the distance between the front of this body and that first bolt hole is maybe only a 1/2 inch. So if you line up the bolt holes, this one is obviously, sticking further up or out, depending on how you have it oriented. So I really like how these are angled. The angle being the same is really good. Now we need to discuss, can this be used? I'm not sure yet. I'm not 100% sure yet, but it's intriguing. So let's take some of these. I'm going to take the Legend. I'm going to take the Prelude. I'm going to take the S2000. We're going to go over to an extra transmission I have sitting on the floor here in my garage. And we're going to hold all of these up to the transmission. We're going to talk about sort of the fit and, again, why I don't like this. I don't like the idea of using the Prelude, trying to find an alternate solution. So follow me over here and let's check these out next to the transmission. Okay, so I'm over here now with my extra transmission just sitting here on the garage floor. Kind of a tight, space to work from, but I think I can show you at least what I want to show you when comparing the Legend slave cylinder, the Prelude slave cylinder, and the S2000 slave cylinder. So let me set the camera down here and I'll zoom in for you. Okay, so basically I've zoomed in here on the mounting location. This is where the 2 bolts go, mounting location for the slave cylinder. And then here's the clutch fork right here that the slave cylinder has to push on. So when comparing these 3, first thing I was talking about earlier was the angle of the mounting tabs on the body. So if you look at the Legend slave cylinder, and you hold it right here where it mounts up. Okay, hopefully you can see there on the video that the body of the slave cylinder is in a direct line with the clutch fork, where the push rod goes. Okay, so what this does is it creates a nice, linear action, nice linear motion, or pretty close to linear motion when you're pressing the clutch pedal. This push rod is pushing out and in, and it's putting an axial force on the piston that's in here. So if you remember, that piston has a like an O-ring or a bushing or whatever you want to call it around the outside. It's pushing on that axially, which is keeping the piston centered inside the bore of the slave cylinder, and by doing so, it's kind of creating even pressure around the perimeter, which is a good thing. The reason I don't like the idea of using the Prelude slave cylinder is, if you notice here, when I hold this up against the mounting point, all right, in order for you to get the push rod into the clutch fork, you've got to bend this at a pretty steep angle. Now, again, like I've said before, Legend owners have done this. They've installed it. They're using it. So it obviously operates. But my fear from a design perspective, from an engineering perspective, is as you're pushing the clutch pedal and this push rod is going in and out, it's pushing on that piston at a pretty extreme angle, which is basically pushing the piston against one side of the cylinder. And so you're putting a lot of stress on one side of that O-ring or that gasket that goes around the piston. And you're going to wear that side out a lot faster, which is going to lead to leaks. Also, if you're compressing one side a lot, the other side may not even hit this side of the cylinder, may not even be touching. So again, leading to some leaks. So for me personally, I don't think I want to run this option. Again, it might work in the short term, but I think you're going to see a lot of slave cylinder failures due to this angle. Now, what I was talking about with the S2000 is because the mounting tabs on the body of the slave cylinder are at the same angle as the Legends. When you mount this up, okay, you're pushing again in a nice straight line on that clutch fork, which is awesome. So again, we have a nice axial load in here. So to me, this is going to last longer. The seals inside, the seals on the piston, that's going to last longer. But we still have a few other things to consider here. As I mentioned, the cylinder bore and the piston itself is slightly larger in diameter. And because of that, if you line up the holes, the mounting holes, the center point of this bore or this cylinder is just slightly different than the center point of this cylinder. So yes, you smart people, you eagle-eyed people out there, you may realize that this piston's actually going to be pointing down, but it's just a hair. It's or not piston, but the push rod. So instead of being perfectly level, it's pointing down just a hair to be able to make it into where the clutch fork is. But again, that angle is much, much less extreme than when you use the Prelude option. The last thing we need to talk about, just as far as mounting it up, and we haven't gotten to the hydraulic side of things yet, and whether or not the larger diameter cylinder and piston is going to have a hydraulic effect. The other thing that we need to consider is because these mounting tabs are further back on the cylinder, that's basically causing this to be mounted further forward. The body of it is mounted, instead of being mounted here like the Legend one would, it's mounted about 1/4 of an inch or so more forward. So the thing I'm going to have to test, I can't really test it on this one because I don't have a clutch and flywheel assembly installed in this transmission, but when this clutch fork is at its furthest back state, is there enough space to compress the push rod, get it in here, and get the bolts through? So can you push this back enough and line up the bolt holes and get the bolts through? If so, you can at least mount it to the transmission. So that's number one. Can we mount it to the transmission? So I'm going to have to test that on my white coupe here behind me, and I'll try to get some video of that or pictures or something like that, just to see if I can mount it. And then the last thing we need to talk about is the hydraulic side of things. So let's move back over to the workbench and let's talk about some of that. Okay, back at the workbench, and let's take a minute to talk about the hydraulics, the math behind the hydraulics, I guess, and what the ramifications may be with changing the slave cylinder bore diameter to a larger bore, the S2000. So we need to know a couple things. We need to know the bore diameter and the stroke length of the master cylinder, and we need to know the bore diameter of the Legend slave and the S2000 slave. So to the best of my ability, using my calipers and also doing some research online, as best I can tell, the actual stroke length, when you have the piston inside of here, the maximum amount that it can deflect is obviously going to be, you know, the maximum distance that this can compress here, right? As the push rod is pushing in on the piston can only travel as much as this distance. I've also, you know, I've measured this a couple different ways, but, you know, again, the best as I can tell, the stroke length of the master cylinder is 1.1 inches. The diameter of the master cylinder is 5/8 of an inch, or 0.625. All right, so I wrote those down, and then I measured the diameter of the Legend slave cylinder and the diameter of the S2000 slave cylinder. So the result of those two measurements, the diameter of both of these, the Legend slave cylinder is 3/4 of an inch, which is 0.75. Again, using my calipers. And here, 0.75. And the S2000 is 0.851 inches, 0.851 inch. So let's go to the computer for a minute and crunch some numbers. All right, so doing some quick math here. Basically, with using the diameter of the Legend master cylinder and the stroke length of 1.1 inches, we're able to calculate using, you know, pi r squared to get the area of that circle times the 1.1 inch stroke length. We're able to calculate that when the master cylinder is fully modulated, that's assuming the clutch pedal can move the piston in the master cylinder the full 1.1 inches. If it's able to do that, then we're basically moving a fluid volume of 0.337 cubic inches. Okay, so using that fluid volume of 0.337 inches, and knowing that the Legend slave cylinder is 0.75 inches in diameter, so to backwards calculating the stroke length, when you compress the master cylinder piston the full 1.1 inches, the slave cylinder is going to move 0.763 inches. So that's the stroke length, the maximum stroke length that the Legend slave cylinder will move. All right, so then if we look at the similar calculation for the S2000 slave cylinder, again taking the same fluid volume of 0.337 inches, the bore diameter of 0.815 inches, and backwards calculating the maximum amount that the S2000 slave cylinder piston will move is going to be 0.646 or 6.47 basically inches. All right, so due to the larger diameter bore, the piston's going to travel less of a distance if you install the S2000 slave cylinder and keep the Legend master cylinder. The difference of that is 0.116 inches. So, will that make a difference if the slave cylinder moves 0.116 or 117, if you round it, inches less? Will that affect the clutch being able to fully, engage or disengage? So, I don't know that off the top of my head. That's something that has to be tested. So we need to put the S2000 slave cylinder on the car and, really essentially drive it and see if that slave cylinder moves enough when you push the clutch pedal down, if it moves enough to engage and disengage the clutch fully. So that's the math behind it. 0.11 inches is, really short distance. So I'm hopeful that this might work. So, I'll hope to test this out a little bit later in the video, or maybe in a following video. Okay, and one last thing I forgot to touch on earlier was the rebuild kit from eBay. So if you open this up and you get the parts out of the rebuild kit, this is a Finco 22165 rebuild kit. If I compare the piston with the one that came out of the Legend, it's a match, so that's good. If I compare that to, for example, the piston out of the Prelude, it's a match. So as far as the rebuild kit goes, the piston, I believe, can be used without issue in the Legend slave cylinder. Again, that's once you clean out the bore, like I'm going to do later in the video. When comparing the other parts, obviously the boot's going to be fine. It fits just fine. That's easy. The last component in this rebuild kit is the spring. And one thing I've noticed when comparing all of these, this spring is a smaller diameter spring. The actual wire itself is a smaller diameter, and it's not quite as stiff of a spring. Compare that to the one that's here on the Prelude. The one on the Prelude matches what came out of the Legend slave cylinder. And again, both of these are larger wire diameters and a little bit firmer of a spring than what comes in the rebuild kit. So my advice, my thought here is, if you do get the rebuild kit, use the piston, use the boot, reuse your original spring. If your original spring is for whatever reason in poor condition, it's deteriorated, it's rusted, something like that, then I would recommend going out and just buying a Prelude or an Integra or a Civic or an Accord, 95 Accord, not the 09, and steal these components, steal the piston and the spring from that. You can also steal the boot, you can steal the push rod, and you can even steal the bleeder screw. You can take all those components and put them in the Legend to rebuild the Legend. Because the S2000 has a slightly larger bore and a slightly larger piston, you're not going to be able to take the piston out of that and stick it in the Legend one. So that's not, you can't swap the parts, but you might, and maybe I'll test this later, you might be able to just use that whole slave cylinder as a whole unit and just bolt it on. So that's something we're going to look into. So I think I've covered everything here for the slave cylinders. So let's take a few minutes and we're going to talk about the master cylinders. All right, so back here at the workbench, I've kind of discussed everything that I wanted to discuss about the slave cylinders. Um, so in review, you can take the components from the Integra or Civic slave cylinder, Prelude and Accord slave cylinder. You can take the internals of these and you can rebuild your Legend one with them. You can get the rebuild kit. I would not recommend using the spring that comes with the kit, but the piston and the boot you could definitely use. And just reuse the spring that came out of there. And then the S2000, although you cannot use the components to rebuild this one, I'm hopeful that that's going to be a direct bolt-on replacement. So again, we've got to test that. So let's move on from the slave cylinders and let's talk about the master cylinders. So similarly, the things that we need to look at when trying to evaluate, can any of these work for the Legend? We need to look at bore diameter, stroke length. We need to look at the distance between where the mounting flange mounts up to the firewall and where online I've heard this piece called a clevis, so I'm going to call it a clevis. The distance between where it mounts to the firewall to where the clevis attaches to the clutch pedal, that length needs to be the same or very close. And then obviously we need the distance between these mounting studs to be the same, so that you don't have to modify your firewall. So I've taken each of these and kind of mocked them up in my car, and also done some measurements with my calipers. So they will all fit, as far as the distance between these studs, they will all fit the Legend firewall. So that's good. Let's check that box off. They all fit. The issue with the S2000 one is that the reservoir is attached to the actual body of the master cylinder, which gets in the way of that black charcoal canister that sits right above the master cylinder. So unfortunately, because that's attached, it's not a suitable replacement unless we as a community can figure out a way to either delete that canister, relocate the canister, or maybe find a smaller one that serves the same purpose but frees up a little bit of space. But for now, I'm going to take that one off the table. The 09 Accord, the reason I got this one and thought it might be usable is because it has a built-in damper. So the Legend factory OEM clutch system has an external damper midway in the clutch line between the master and the slave cylinder. And my thought was, well, if this fits, it's got a built-in damper, and you kind of retain sort of that factory feel that the damper gives you. I believe the damper is only on the 6 speeds and not on the 5 speeds. The issue is just the body of this is so large that it doesn't really fit very well between the firewall and the wheel arch, the little space that's allotted for the master cylinder to go. This hits on the wheel well inside the engine bay. So not a great option here. If you were to dent that fender well, I think you could probably dent it just a little bit, and you might be able to use that one. So let me look at these two, and they actually both fit in there pretty well. If you notice, the difference between these and the Legend is a majority of the cylinder, I guess you'd call it. The majority of the cylinder on the Legend one exists inside the firewall. So this is kind of inside where the clutch pedal is and where your feet go, and just has a little bit that extends into the engine bay. These proportionally are different. So this has a little bit more that sticks out into the engine bay and a little bit more that sticks out into the engine bay. But what I have found is that they do actually fit physically. It's very tight. Again, the back side of this comes really close to the inside of that fender well, but I am able to get it in there and it's not touching. So that's good. So as far as physically fitting in the space allotted for the master cylinder, both of these fit. And both of these can be mounted, bolted up to the firewall. So then really the last thing we need to look at is, like I mentioned earlier, the distance between this flange where it hits the firewall and the point at which it mounts to the clutch pedal. So on the Legend one, with the piston, with this piece fully extended, the push rod sits about here, approximately there, and the distance between the firewall flange and the center of that hole is about 5 3/4 of an inch. The distance between this one is about 4, almost 4 1/4, not quite. There is some adjustability there, so let's just call it 4 1/4. That's a little bit far off. The 97 Prelude or 95 Accord master cylinder. Again, if I put this right here where it would live, and I measure this distance, we've got about 5 1/2 inches. So 5 1/2 inches here because this push rod is longer versus 5 1/4 here because this push rod is shorter. Hold these up next to each other, you can see longer push rod versus shorter push rod. So there is a chance, because there's only a 1/4 of an inch difference, there is a chance that you can mount this against the firewall and install this push rod just as it comes, and it'll reach the clutch pedal. You may have to push the clutch pedal down just a hair to be able to get that that pin through it, the pin that goes through here, and then the pedal. So you might have to push the clutch pedal down just a little bit. Basically what that would cause is, in the free state where you're not touching any of the pedals, that clutch pedal just wouldn't be quite as high. It would be down just a hair from where it would be if you're using the Legend. The alternative, and what I'm going to test out, if that doesn't work, I think what could be done is you could use the shorter Legend push rod, use a coupler on the end of this, and get an additional, short, maybe 1 inch or so length of threaded rod to make, kind of an assembly that's the right length. And then when you put this push rod coupler with additional threaded rod on the end, when you put that in there, you're gonna make the length exactly what it needs to be. It would all be adjustable, and you'd be able to make that length exactly what it needs to be to hook up to the clutch pedal. So as far as physically fitting and physically attaching to the Legend firewall, the Legend clutch pedal, and all of that, I think that the Prelude and Accord option is going to be the best. The Civic and Integra one, I think you could do a similar thing. You could use the Legend push rod, a coupler, some more threaded rod, and you could make it the right length. The only reason really why I would tend to lean towards using this over this is because the distance here between where the clutch line attaches to the master cylinder, the distance from there to where the firewall is a little bit smaller. It's a tighter space to work with than here, and also like the angle that this is. So I think this is going to be a little bit more friendly. Now, no matter what, if you use any of these, you're not going to be able to use the factory Legend clutch hard line. So you're going to have to switch to like a braided, flexible braided stainless steel braid hose. But I don't think that's a problem. Some people consider that to be an upgrade anyways. So take out all of the hard lines, take out the damper, the factory damper, and just connect a flexible braided line to the prelude and run it down and connect it to your slave cylinder of choice. The last thing to compare between these, which I hadn't touched on previously, is going to be the fact that this one and this one, I didn't even take those apart, but these two both have the same bore diameter and have the same piston design and piston length as the Legend one does. And so from a hydraulic standpoint, we're not changing anything as far as the hydraulics go. You're going to have the same diameter here. You're going to have the same stroke length. So I think all of that is perfectly fine. I don't think we're going to change any of the dynamics of the clutch pedal or the clutch feel. And then lastly, the last thing that I wanted to touch on was, if you are trying to rebuild the Legend master cylinder, what other model master cylinders could you rob parts from? So again, I bought a rebuild kit. This is the Finco 22172. I bought that from eBay. Hold on just a minute. Sorry about that. Had somebody talking to me in the background, and also wanted to go ahead and pop the piston out of the Prelude slave cylinder. So when we compare what came out of the Legend and we compare what comes with the rebuild kit, and we compare what comes out of the Prelude, and it would be the same for the Integra, and we put these all side by side. The one that comes with the rebuild kit, not sure how well y'all can see this in the video. Let me bring this a little closer. So I'm not sure where I left off, but we have the rebuild kit piston, we've got the Legend, and we have the Prelude piston. The rebuild kit one is slightly longer than the OEM Legend one and the Prelude one. So my recommendation, just based on looking at this, is that I would not use the rebuild kit. Also, the other thing that I've noticed, I don't know if you can, sorry, this focus. See how this is loose right here? I'm not sure why it's loose like that, but the Legend one is nice and tight, and the one that came in the Prelude has a little bit of movement, but it's still pretty tight. So for these reasons, if you're rebuilding your Legend master cylinder, I personally would not get the rebuild kit. I would just go out and buy a 97 Prelude and, again, rob the components from it and use them to rebuild your Legend one. So hopefully everything I've talked about makes sense. You understand what components may be usable for rebuilding your Legend master cylinder and slave cylinder, and then also what components may be a direct bolt-in replacement. So based on everything that I've talked about, I've kind of narrowed it down. I'm going to test using the 97 Prelude master cylinder with the S2000 slave cylinder. I'm going to return all these other ones. I'm going to keep those two, and I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to continue with my rebuild efforts on the OEM Legend ones, but I'm also going to see if these two items would just be bolt-in replacements and make everything easy for the community. So check back in with you soon.